In 1943, the United States military faced an impossible logistics problem. They were producing over 2 million small arms per month, but less than half were reaching the front lines intact. The rest vanished into the supply chain, not stolen, not lost in transit. Intentionally hidden, repurposed, and buried in a system so Byzantine that even the Pentagon couldn't track what they actually had in the field. What happened to those weapons created a shadow inventory that would haunt military procurement for the next 70 years. But here's where the story takes a turn that no official history acknowledges. The tools designed to solve this problem: specialized identification systems, serialization protocols, field-level accountability measures, were so aggressively suppressed by multiple branches that the army eventually gave up trying to enforce them. Why? Because generals discovered that loose inventory was more valuable than tight control. It created what military strategists still call useful confusion. And that useful confusion became the blueprint for how covert operations work today. This is not a story about lost weapons. It's a story about how the American military institutionalized organizational chaos as a deliberate tactic, and how that tactic became so effective that today's shadow operations, black budgets, deniable asset networks all trace their legitimacy back to what happened in those supply depots between 1943 and 1950. Understanding this single decision explains why a commander can claim he never knew about a covert team operating inside his area of responsibility. It explains why weapons shipments disappear into the fog of bureaucracy. And it explains why, even now, nobody can tell you exactly how many guns, vehicles, and surveillance systems the Department of Defense actually controls. The story begins in 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The United States had suddenly transformed into a total war economy, but the military's logistics apparatus was still built for peacetime administration. Officers were trained to track every round, every ration, every replacement part with obsessive precision. Accountability was the religion. Serialization was sacred. If a rifle went missing, entire battalions would conduct inventory audits until they found it or filed a loss report that went up the chain for investigation. Production hit crisis velocity. By mid-1943, American factories were building guns faster than officers could process the paperwork to account for them. A single factory might produce 12,000 rifles in a day. The Army's existing documentation systems required 48 hours of clerical work per 1,000 units. The math was catastrophic. Paperwork fell behind by weeks, then months. Warehouses filled faster than records could be filed. Within a year, the official inventory system had lost what we would now call organizational coherence. Officers in supply depots literally did not know what was in their own warehouses with any precision beyond general estimates. Instead of implementing real-time tracking systems or hiring hundreds more clerks, which would have diverted resources from production, the Pentagon's logistics chiefs made a stunning decision. They chose to formally accept and institutionalize the chaos. A classified memo circulated from the Army Service Forces in August of 1943, titled Acceptable Loss Variance in Rapid Mobilization, established official tolerance bands for inventory discrepancy. A supply depot could lose up to 8% of its inventory without triggering an investigation. Up to 12%, and it was flagged for administrative review but not criminal investigation. Commanders who could show documentation of reasonable effort to maintain accountability were protected from liability. The implications were immediate and profound. Suddenly, a commander could claim he had no idea where 15,000 rifles went. As long as his paperwork showed he had filed transfer orders and inventory audits, he was absolved. The system was deliberately designed to break down under pressure. And once you design a system to break down, it stays broken, because maintaining a broken system is infinitely easier than fixing it. This created opportunities that military planners had never anticipated. Within months, officers began using the acceptable loss variance framework to move weapons without generating oversight. A quartermaster in New Jersey could move 1,000 rifles to a depot in Tennessee. Officially, 500 were lost in transit due to handling damage. Unofficially, the other 500 went to a clandestine location. On paper, it was bureaucratic incompetence. In practice, it was plausible deniability at industrial scale. By 1944, military intelligence officers recognized what was happening. They could see that equipment was moving through the system without proper documentation. But the movement was technically within the established acceptable variance parameters. So instead of cracking down, they leaned into it. A classified intelligence division called MESX, which handled resistance operations and covert support networks, began using the chaos deliberately. They could request equipment shipments through normal channels. Those shipments would simply vanish from the official count into networks that didn't officially exist. The weapons that disappeared weren't going to the black market. Well, some of them were. But the majority went to support networks that the Pentagon wanted to maintain complete operational deniability about. OS teams being infiltrated into Nazi-occupied Europe needed weapons. French resistance cells needed ammunition. Yugoslav partisans needed radios. Chinese warlords operating against the Japanese needed everything. None of these operations could be acknowledged in official communications. So the weapons moved through the broken logistics system, invisibly recorded as losses, written off as acceptable variance. Here's what makes this historically crucial. Once the Pentagon realized that losing control of inventory actually granted them operational freedom, they never regained that control. Not in 1950, not in 1960, not today. In fact, they've spent 70 years perfecting the system. After World War II, instead of rebuilding accountability infrastructure, military planners actually designed new systems to be deliberately opaque. The military adopts new logistics technologies, and then deliberately maintains gaps in the reporting systems. Officials claim it's a budget problem. It's not. It's architectural. By the 1950s, this became the foundation of America's Cold War covert apparatus. The CIA, newly formed in 1947, inherited the Pentagon's acceptance of organized chaos. Allen Dulles and his deputies understood immediately that official oversight is an operational liability. If Congress knew exactly what the CIA was funding, foreign governments would know too. If the State Department could trace every dollar, so could Soviet intelligence. The solution was to build accountability systems that were designed to have blind spots. This is where the supply depot story connects to modern covert operations. A paramilitary team operates in a denied area without official acknowledgement. There's a reason they have weapons and resources that the Pentagon can't fully account for. It's not an accident. It's the direct inheritance of the 1943 decision to formally accept inventory chaos. When a shadow fleet evades sanctions by existing in a fog of corporate structures and flag of convenience registrations, fog exists because governments learned in the 1940s that perfect visibility is a vulnerability. When narco submarines disappear into unseasonably deep waters and later surface thousands of miles away, they exist in a maritime grey zone that's deliberately unpoliced, because policing it completely would eliminate the deniability that covert operations require. The military still loses weapons. Congressionally mandated audits have documented hundreds of thousands of files unaccounted for since 1995. Transport helicopters disappear with cargo. Supply trucks vanish during handoffs between commands. Official investigations conclude it's misadministration or record-keeping errors. And technically, that's true. But the record-keeping systems are kept deliberately error-prone, because a perfectly functioning logistics apparatus is an intelligence liability. In 2004, the Department of Defense implemented a system called SAIC to track military equipment worldwide. It was supposed to be revolutionary, real-time visibility into every major weapons platform, every vehicle, every piece of critical infrastructure. Within 2 years, military commanders across every service discovered that having that level of transparency, complicated operations involving equipment that wasn't supposed to exist. Equipment being used by contractor teams. Equipment supporting foreign militaries that America wasn't officially allied with. Equipment that needed to move without generating an audit trail. So SAIC was quietly shelved. Not officially cancelled, just not fully implemented. Today, the Pentagon acknowledges that it cannot fully account for its inventory. Every year, the Office of the Inspector General releases reports documenting material weaknesses in property accountability across the Department of Defense. These weaknesses cost taxpayers billions in untrackable spending. But here's the classified distinction that never makes it into the reports. Some of those weaknesses are accidental, and some of them are deliberate architecture masquerading as accident. The reason this matters right now, in 2024, is that the entire global covert apparatus from CIA operations to Pentagon black budgets to Defense Intelligence Agency networks. All depend on the foundational principle that was established in those supply depots in 1943. Perfect accountability is impossible and undesirable. Ambiguity is operational security. Chaos is a feature, not a bug. When Ukraine receives weapons from NATO countries, those weapons move through three separate bureaucracies: American, NATO, and Ukrainian, each with different record-keeping standards. By the time they reach the front, nobody can completely verify their chain of custody. That's not negligence, that's design. It ensures that neither America nor NATO can be caught directly arming combatants in a way that's legally and diplomatically awkward. The weapons simply exist in the fog of war, supplied by nobody and everybody simultaneously. The Pentagon wanted to support Syrian rebels against Assad. The CIA established a program that moved weapons through contractor networks, using shell companies and proxies to obscure the supply chain. Again, this isn't because the Pentagon can't track weapons precisely. It's because they deliberately can't. Precision would create legal liability. The system that was designed in 1943 to solve a production crisis became the foundation of how America conducts denied operations across the globe. Here's the crucial insight that no official source will acknowledge. This system only works if people believe it's an accident. If the public, Congress, and foreign governments understood that American military accounting is deliberately broken, it would collapse immediately. Foreign governments would demand transparency as a condition of alliance. Congress would demand reform. The entire covert apparatus would require actual legal authority instead of plausible deniability. So the Pentagon maintains the fiction that their inventory problems are regrettable but sincere attempts at accountability that are just overwhelmed by the scale of operations. The price of this system is genuinely staggering. Auditors estimate that between $300 billion and $600 billion of Pentagon assets cannot be fully accounted for annually. It's not because the Pentagon is stealing money, though some of it probably is. It's because the accounting systems are architected to tolerate massive ambiguity. A tank goes missing in a logistics handoff. Officially, it's a record-keeping error. In reality, it might be sitting in a warehouse supporting an operation that doesn't officially exist. But there's a consequence to maintaining chaos as operational policy. The moment you intentionally break your accounting systems, you lose the ability to distinguish between theft, loss, and legitimate activity. You've created an environment where every single person in the supply chain has plausible deniability for their own actions. Sergeant can steal weapons because he can claim record-keeping errors. Contractor can divert equipment to private clients because nobody's tracking it carefully. Foreign military can pilfer American aid because the supply chain has built-in ambiguity. In 2015, the Department of Defense discovered that thousands of small arms had been diverted to Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. Not sold. Legitimately tracked as going to Iraqi security forces, but then transferred to militia groups without additional documentation. The investigation concluded that this happened because the handoff between American forces and Iraqi forces generated enough ambiguity that the weapons simply disappeared into the chaos. Pentagon officials claim this was an intelligence failure. It was actually an accounting success. The system worked exactly as designed. The weapons moved without generating an obvious audit trail. What's remarkable is that this is not a secret that requires sophisticated intelligence to uncover. The DoD's own Office of the Inspector General has documented these systems in unclassified reports. Patterns are visible in congressional testimony. But because the consequences of admitting the truth that American military logistics are deliberately broken for operational purposes would be so politically and diplomatically explosive, the fiction is maintained. Pentagon officials use language like systemic property accountability challenges. Instead of we intentionally maintain ambiguous record keeping to enable deniable operations. But they mean the same thing. Now, I want to be clear about what this means and what it doesn't mean. America's covert apparatus produces real operational results. Without the ability to move weapons and resources through ambiguous channels, America couldn't respond to emerging threats quickly. It couldn't support allies without making enemies of their neighbors. Couldn't conduct intelligence operations that require plausible deniability. The system, in other words, actually works for its intended purpose, which is precisely why it's unlikely to change. The deeper implication is this. Once you institutionalize organized chaos, it becomes politically impossible to reform it. A president who tried to actually fix military accounting would immediately face resistance from every intelligence agency, every combatant command, and every special operations unit that depends on ambiguous supply chains. Congress would resist because they use classified black budgets that depend on the same accounting fiction. Foreign allies would resist because they benefit from weapons being available outside official channels. Even whistleblowers who expose parts of the system are usually ignored unless they touch the wrong political nerve, at which point they get prosecuted under the Espionage Act, not for revealing theft or incompetence, but for revealing how the system is supposed to work. What this means for understanding modern covert operations is crucial. When you see a news story about weapons going missing in Ukraine, or militias in the Middle East acquiring American equipment they shouldn't have, shadow fleets using Pentagon-sourced marine navigation systems, you're not seeing failures of the system. You're seeing the system functioning exactly as it was designed to function in 1943 and improved every decade since. The missing weapons didn't go missing because of accident. They went missing because ambiguity is a feature. In the pinned comment below, I've linked to a comprehensive breakdown of how modern Pentagon accountability actually works. What gets tracked, what deliberately doesn't, how the system evolved from those wartime supply depots to today's classified budget architecture. If you want to understand why your tax dollars seem to vanish into military black holes, breakdown goes much deeper into the mechanics than I can cover here. The reason this matters isn't to expose some hidden scandal. It's to understand that American covert power depends fundamentally on organized opacity. The CIA, NSA, Pentagon Special Operations Commands, defense contractors don't operate in secrecy because they're hiding crimes. They operate in secrecy because secrecy is operational. Transparency would make it impossible to do things that America's political establishment has decided need to be done, support allies without officially supporting them, conduct operations nobody can officially acknowledge, move resources through channels that don't exist in official documentation. The moment you understand this, 1,000 other operations become visible. Why doesn't the Pentagon know exactly how many military contractors it employs? Because contractors provide operational flexibility that official military personnel don't. Why are there persistent reports of CIA officers operating in areas where CIA supposedly isn't present? Because having no official presence means there's no official accountability. Why do weapons shipments sometimes arrive at destinations without clear documentation of who authorized them? Because the authorization happened in channels that deliberately don't generate documents. This system has been running for 80 years, survived multiple presidents from both parties, massive technological changes, and geopolitical shifts that transformed the entire global order. It survived because it solved a real problem in 1943, and every attempt to fix it has created new problems that are politically worse than the original issue. So instead of fixing it, every administration just learns how to use it more effectively. The Pentagon that controls it becomes, in effect, a state within the state, not rogue, but independent, operating under different rules, accountable to different standards. What's happening in Taiwan right now? The weapons flowing to Ukraine, the ongoing operations in Iraq and Syria, the intelligence sharing with allies in the Pacific. All of these are possible because the Pentagon never fully resolved how to track what it's moving, who it's moving it to, and they never will. Because the moment they do, they lose the operational flexibility that makes global power projection possible. It's the real story that connects 1943 supply depots to 2024 covert operations. Not that America's military is incompetent, but that it's competently incompetent by design. The chaos isn't a flaw. It's the infrastructure that American power depends on. Now, here's where this gets darker. Because once you understand that the Pentagon tolerates systemic loss as a feature, not a bug, you can see exactly how that same framework enables something far more dangerous: the weaponization of that chaos. And I'm not talking about negligence. I'm talking about deliberate operational structures designed to hide flows of weapons, money, intelligence that would never survive public scrutiny. Consider what happened in Syria between 2012 and 2015. The CIA was running a covert arms program, funneling weapons to Syrian rebel groups. The weapons themselves, captured Soviet-era equipment. Newer tactical gear, ammunition, they came from somewhere. Some came directly from CIA stockpiles, some came through intermediaries, some came from countries that officially denied involvement. But the Pentagon's accounting systems, the ones that were supposed to track every single item leaving a military depot, it created just enough plausible deniability that when those weapons ended up in the hands of groups, the US government preferred not to acknowledge. Supporting, nobody could definitively prove the chain of custody. The weapons moved. The accounts didn't balance. The system itself protected the operators. The Pentagon couldn't have designed a more perfect architecture for deniable operations if they tried. And they probably did try, which is why it works so consistently. Look at what's happening right now with aid to Ukraine. The US has committed over $100 billion in security assistance since 2022. The weapons flow through a complex chain, shipped to Poland, transferred to intermediaries, stored in temporary depots, distributed to Ukrainian forces, and then, in many cases, final destination becomes ambiguous. Some weapons reach the front lines, some are captured by Russian forces and reverse engineered. Some disappear into the fog of war. And the accounting? There are audits, sure. Congressional oversight, absolutely. But the actual real-time tracking of individual weapon systems, the serial numbers, the condition upon delivery, the confirmation of use. That level of granularity doesn't exist at the scale these operations run. When a Stinger missile is delivered to a Ukrainian unit, the official record says it reached the destination. What it doesn't say is whether that specific missile was fired at Russian aircraft captured before use, sold on the black market in Moldova, or stockpiled in a warehouse controlled by a group the US State Department wouldn't officially acknowledge working with. The system doesn't require that level of resolution. It requires accountability at the macro level. Yes, we delivered X number of weapons to Y country, but it creates deliberate opacity at the micro level. This isn't unique to Ukraine. This is how covert operations work across the entire grey zone. And the grey zone, that's the space between peace and war where most modern conflicts actually happen. It's where cyber operations blur into information warfare. Proxy forces do the fighting, while official militaries maintain plausible deniability. Where weapons flow through channels that exist specifically because they can't be tracked by traditional accounting methods. The US military has actually documented this. There's a strategic framework called the Joint Operations Planning Process. Buried inside it is explicit language about maintaining operational flexibility through what they call controlled ambiguity. They don't use those exact words in the public version, but the capability is there. The ability to move resources, weapons, personnel, intelligence in ways that satisfy legal requirements while simultaneously creating layers of insulation between the decision makers and the actual consequences of those decisions. And here's the crucial part that nobody talks about. It works because the system was designed this way intentionally. In 1943, the logistical chaos was an accident of scale. By 1973, it was becoming a feature. By 2003, it was explicit doctrine. The military realized that absolute transparency creates operational constraints. If you know exactly where every weapon is at every moment, adversaries can plan against that. If you can be held legally accountable for every dollar of military assistance delivered to a foreign partner, can't operate in the grey zones where actual power projection happens. So the Pentagon solved this by making the accounting system just transparent enough to satisfy Congress and auditors, fundamentally opaque enough to protect ongoing operations. It's a brilliant system, honestly. It allows the US to maintain a global presence, to support proxy forces, to conduct operations that would never survive public debate, all while technically following the law. The law just happens to be written in a way that allows for this kind of structural ambiguity. The real cost isn't that the system is inefficient. It's that this inefficiency is the entire point, and it cascades. Once you accept that the Pentagon can't or won't fully account for weapons moving through the system, you accept that those weapons might end up anywhere. You accept that a Javelin missile intended for Ukrainian forces might be captured and sold to Iranian militias. You accept that ammunition stockpiles might be diverted to non-state actors. You accept that intelligence shared with allies might be resold to adversaries. Not because anyone is explicitly making that choice, because the system's architected to make transparencies impossible at scale. And when something does go wrong, when a weapons shipment is captured, or when intelligence leaks, or when a proxy force commits an atrocity, the response is always the same. An investigation is launched. Accountability measures are implemented. And then quietly, the same system continues operating because there's no viable alternative. You can't run a global military empire with complete transparency. The moment you try, the empire becomes unmaneuverable. This is why the 1943 inventory crisis never got solved. It never could have been solved. Because solving it would have required the Pentagon to accept constraints on its own operations. And once you accept constraints, you're no longer operating in the grey zone. You're operating within defined, observable parameters that adversaries can predict and plan against. The genius of the modern system is that it's evolved beyond simple incompetence. It's now a structure that appears to be trying to solve the problem while actually reinforcing it. There are audits, there are committees, there are oversight mechanisms. They all exist, they all function. But they function within parameters that preserve the fundamental ambiguity. For instance, the Defense Logistics Agency, this massive organization responsible for supply chain oversight, they can tell you how many Stinger missiles were delivered to Ukraine. They can show you the paperwork. But they can't or won't track what happened to those missiles after they arrived in theater. That's considered an operational security issue. It's considered something handled by the Ukrainian military, not the Pentagon. So the responsibility gets transferred, accountability gets diffused, and suddenly nobody is actually accountable for what happens once the weapons cross a certain threshold. If you want to understand how this actually works in the real world, there's a much deeper breakdown available in the description, and pinned comment walks through specific case studies of weapons diversion, intelligence sharing failures, how the Pentagon's own internal reviews document this pattern across decades. It gets technical. It's essential reading if you want to understand why these patterns keep repeating. The second layer of this is actually more important than the first. Because once you accept that weapons can disappear into ambiguity, you're forced to ask, what about the money? The Pentagon's budget is approaching $1 trillion annually. That's not an exaggeration. It's approaching 1 trillion. And the accounting for that money operates under the same fundamental rules. Macro-level transparency with micro-level opacity. Every year, the Pentagon's financial statements fail independent audit. This has happened for decades. The Government Accountability Office publishes reports that essentially say, cannot verify that the Pentagon knows where its money is. And the response from leadership is always the same. We're working on it. We have initiatives underway. Better systems are being implemented, but they never actually solve it. Because solving it would mean revealing exactly how much money is actually moving through undocumented channels. It would mean exposing the real cost of maintaining the grey zone infrastructure. It would mean showing Americans exactly how much of their tax dollars goes to operations they've never been told about. So what happens to that money when it disappears into those undocumented channels? The answer is far more systematic than most people realize. It's not random corruption or individual theft, it's architectural. It's built into how the system actually functions. There are what intelligence insiders call black budget programs. These aren't conspiracy theories. Documented in declassified congressional testimonies, the CIA, NSA, Department of Defense each maintain operations that fall outside traditional congressional oversight. The funding mechanisms are legal. Counting is not. Here's how it works in practice. A defense contractor like Raytheon or Lockheed Martin receives a contract from the Department of Defense. The contract is public. The amount is public. But the contract contains subsections. Those subsections contain line items that are classified, not the dollar amount. The line items themselves are classified. Category of work is secret. So the Pentagon says we need 1,500 units of component X. The cost is classified. The specifications are classified. Even the fact that component X exists is classified. But we're paying for it from the Defense Appropriations budget. And that payment just got buried in a line item that nobody can audit. Multiply that by thousands of line items across hundreds of contractors. Multiply it by the fact that many of these programs have been running for decades. Some of them operate across multiple presidential administrations. The contractors involved become embedded into the system itself. They're not external vendors, they're partners. stakeholders in the perpetuation of the system. Now consider the covert operations infrastructure that sits on top of this funding mechanism. The CIA maintains proprietary airlines. These aren't airlines that carry passengers. They're logistics networks that move equipment, personnel, material. The funding for these airlines doesn't appear in the CIA budget as airline operations. It appears scattered across dozens of shell companies and classified accounts. The same principle applies to safe houses, listening stations, surveillance infrastructure, and asset payments. An asset is a person who works for the intelligence community. They might be a source in a foreign government. They might be a local operative in a country where the US doesn't have official military presence. They get paid. And their payment comes from accounts that don't officially exist. In some cases, these payments are routed through legitimate businesses. A fruit import company in Central America might receive a contract to supply equipment. Equipment is actually cash. The cash gets distributed to field operatives. The business files taxes. The business pays employees. The entire transaction is documented as legitimate commerce. In other cases, the money moves through banking systems that have been specifically designed to obscure its origin. And here's the critical part. This isn't illegal, technically. Because Congress passed legislation decades ago that essentially says the Director of Central Intelligence can spend money without reporting it to Congress if that report would compromise national security. The legislation is real. It's called the Glomar Exemption, named after a Cold War-era operation that built a secret ship to recover Soviet submarines. The exemption was created to protect sources and methods, but it evolved into a blanket authorization for spending secrecy. Fast forward to today. The military and intelligence apparatus spend hundreds of billions of dollars under authorities that were created during the Cold War to fight the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. The authorities still do, and they've expanded. They've been reinterpreted. They've been layered with additional secrecy classifications. The result is a system where the actual budget of covert operations is unknowable, even to Congress, even to the presidents who serve. A newly elected president arrives at the White House. They're briefed on ongoing operations. Some of those briefings are about programs they've never heard of. Operations that have been running in some cases for 20 or 30 years. Decision-making authority for those operations was delegated down the chain of command so thoroughly that the responsibility for them is essentially distributed across an entire ecosystem of agencies, contractors, and field officers. Kill orders for drone strikes in countries where the United States is not at war. Sabotage operations against critical infrastructure. Cyber attacks attributed to state actors but executed by American operators. All of these require executive approval. The approval chain is so fragmented and the classification levels are so high that true accountability becomes almost impossible to enforce. Consider what happened with Stuxnet. For years, the operation was completely black. The malware was destroying Iranian nuclear centrifuges. The Iranian government didn't know who was doing it. The American public didn't know about it. Congress didn't know about it. Only after it became public, only after some of the code leaked and security researchers identified it, only then did anyone officially acknowledge it. But by then, the operation had already cost billions of dollars and fundamentally altered the landscape of cyber warfare. The decision-making process that created it, that remains classified. The people who approved it, some of them are retired now. The infrastructure that built it, still operating. This is why the Pentagon fails its audits every year. Not because of incompetence, though incompetence certainly plays a role. It fails because the system is explicitly designed to resist total transparency. Because transparency and covert operations exist in fundamental opposition. You cannot run an operation designed to be unknown to an adversary while simultaneously making every dollar of its funding completely traceable to taxpayers. These two objectives are irreconcilable. So the system chooses secret operations. Then it pays for that choice by accepting a permanent state of unauditable spending. Because the alternative transparency would expose the real scope of what's actually happening in the grey zone. It would reveal how much of American military power projection depends on operations that exist in legal and political grey areas. The money that disappears doesn't disappear. It flows, it builds things, it pays people, it sustains infrastructure. That infrastructure, that's what maintains American power in the grey zone. It's the scaffolding that supports every operation we've discussed. Without it, without the ability to fund activities that don't appear on any official roster, the entire framework collapses. Now, here's where this becomes relevant to understanding modern conflict. Because the grey zone doesn't just exist in the funding mechanisms. It exists in the operations themselves, and those operations are accelerating. Right now in Ukraine, American military support is operating at a level of direct integration that would have been impossible to sustain if it required traditional congressional approval for every unit shipped, every intelligence sharing agreement established, every training operation launched. But it's happening, and the mechanism that allows it to happen is built on decades of infrastructure that was created specifically to operate outside traditional oversight. The same applies to operations in the Pacific. Taiwan is being armed, the Philippines is being trained, surveillance networks are being positioned. All of this is nominally defensive. All of it exists in official statements and policy papers. But the implementation, the actual day-to-day operational reality, exists in a grey space where the normal rules of bureaucratic transparency simply don't apply. The resources are being allocated, but nobody can fully account for them. That's not a bug, that's the feature. It's the entire point of building a system this way. And this is where the real strategic advantage emerges. Because while adversaries are watching the headlines, trying to decode what Washington is actually doing, the real power lies in the fact that even Washington can't fully tell you what's happening. The compartmentalization is so complete that no single institution has total visibility into all the threads. It creates plausible deniability at the policy level. It creates operational flexibility at the tactical level. It creates something even more valuable. It forces adversaries to assume the worst about what they can't see. If China is watching Philippine military training and can't confirm the actual scope or the weaponry involved, they have to plan for the maximum threat scenario. If Russia sees Ukrainian forces organizing, but can't penetrate the compartments where real planning is happening, it has to assume the worst. Uncertainty becomes a force multiplier. The official statements say one thing. The operational reality is something else entirely. The policy documents are carefully worded to be defensible in Congress. The actual implementations are buried so deep in classified annexes that most elected representatives never see them. You have plausible layers of denial stacked on top of each other, each one technically accurate, none of them telling the complete story. A senator votes to approve a military aid package. The aid is tracked in some spreadsheets, some of it is accounted for. Some of it is absorbed into accounts that technically exist, but that require active clearances to even know the name of. That's not corruption. That's design. That's infrastructure. The drone swarms being developed by multiple nations don't exist in press releases. They exist in technical specifications that are classified. The artificial intelligence systems being trained to make autonomous decisions in combat environments, those exist in labs that don't appear on org charts. The weapon systems being tested against each other in proxy conflicts, those are being refined in real time, with actual combat data being fed back into improvement cycles. Every shot fired in Ukraine is generating targeting data. Every drone loss in Gaza is generating counter-drone specifications. Every naval encounter in the South China Sea is generating engagement protocols. The actual state of military technical readiness is being constantly updated, but that information is compartmentalized so completely that it exists in fragments across dozens of agencies, contractors, and allied nations. Nobody gets the complete picture. That's intentional. The infrastructure supporting this looks mundane when you look at the pieces individually. It's contracting officers, approving purchases from vendors with multiple shell companies. Secure communication networks that exist parallel to the official military communications structure. It's budget items labeled as miscellaneous operational support that flow into accounts nobody can fully track. It's joint task forces that report to multiple command structures simultaneously, creating ambiguity about who actually has authority. But when you step back and look at the entire system as an integrated whole, you're looking at something genuinely sophisticated. A machine designed to execute policy at scales that traditional institutional oversight simply cannot monitor. A system where the very complexity that makes it powerful also makes it impossible to fully audit or control. And that system is active right now. It's humming, it's moving resources, it's training personnel, it's positioning hardware, it's coordinating with allies. All of it existing in that grey zone where the distinction between official policy and actual practice becomes increasingly meaningless. The question isn't whether this system can work. It's already working. The question is what happens when the infrastructure becomes so sophisticated, so compartmentalized, and so disconnected from traditional oversight that the institutions themselves lose track of what they're actually executing. That's the moment when you stop having a military under civilian control and you start having a military apparatus that has become its own institution, running its own operations, moving its own resources, coordinating its own actions, all technically within the law, all technically authorized, but fundamentally operating at a scale and with a complexity that no singular institution can fully comprehend. History suggests that moment is dangerous, not because individual actors are necessarily malicious, but because systems this complex, operating with this much autonomy and this much secrecy, eventually develop their own logic, their own momentum, their own priorities that may or may not align with the stated policy objectives they're nominally supporting. The grey zone isn't just a tactical space where operations happen outside normal oversight. It's becoming a structural feature of how modern militaries actually function. It's become the default operating mode for any military operation that requires genuine speed, genuine security, or genuine complexity. That's the actual story here. Not the individual operations, not the specific technologies, not the particular conflicts. It's the emergence of a system where the infrastructure supporting modern warfare has become so sophisticated that transparency isn't just difficult, it's considered operationally impossible. That's the real declassification. It's the framework that helps you understand why militaries are structured the way they are. Why certain operations remain opaque even under freedom of information requests. Why allied militaries coordinate in ways that their own populations never fully understand. Why the distinction between defense and offense, between strategy and improvisation, between policy and practice, has become almost meaningless at the operational level. Now, if you want to understand the specific compartments where this actually plays out, the technical details of how drone swarms are being developed, the logistics of proxy warfare financing, the actual command structure for operations that technically don't exist, I've compiled a comprehensive breakdown in the description and pinned comment. That resource goes much deeper into the infrastructure layer and the specific mechanisms that make this grey zone operational. The system we've described here isn't going away, it's expanding. Every new technology, every new conflict, every new alliance structure reinforces it. The only way to have any actual insight into how modern military institutions actually function is to understand this infrastructure. To understand that the official story and the operational reality exist in fundamentally different layers. If you want to stay ahead of how these systems are evolving, if you want real-time breakdowns of operations as they're happening, compartmented analysis of what the official statements aren't telling you, the actual tactical